Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I am a writer and a storyteller. I hope you enjoy the journey I've written for you today. So get cozy and relax. Tuesday looked exactly like Monday, which looked exactly like the Friday before it. A carbon copy of a day that had already happened 1,000 times. Sitting in the gray fabric cubicle, the fluorescent lights overhead hummed that same low, headache-inducing buzz, a sound that felt like it was drilling slowly into the base of my skull. The spreadsheet on the monitor was a sea of endless numbers, rows 800 to row 9,000, columns of data that meant absolutely nothing to anyone. Especially me. Taking a sip of the company coffee, it tasted like burnt plastic and lukewarm water, just like it did yesterday, and just like it would tomorrow. This wasn't just a job. It was a loop, a gray circle of waking up at 6:30 a.m., driving on Interstate 45 in bumper-to-bumper traffic, staring at a screen for 8 hours, and then driving home to sleep. People walked by the desk, their shoes scuffing on the thin carpet. "Morning, Jonathan," they said, their voices flat, almost robotic. "Morning," I replied, not even looking up, typing the same meaningless codes into the same meaningless boxes. It felt less like living and more like waiting. Needing a break from the crushing boredom, standing up to walk to the break room felt like a major expedition. The hallway was the same beige tunnel I had walked down for 5 years, lined with the same motivational posters about teamwork and synergy that hung slightly crooked on the walls. But then, turning the corner past the water cooler, the rhythm broke. There, nestled between the supply closet and the men's restroom, was a door. Not a beige door, not a glass door, a bright, screaming crimson-red door made of heavy steel. It hadn't been there at 10 a.m. when I got my first coffee. It hadn't been there yesterday. It sat there like a fresh wound in the wall, vivid and shocking against the pale paint, pulsing with a strange, silent energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. Looking around, nobody else seemed to notice it. Sarah from accounting walked right past it, her eyes glued to her phone, swiping left, swiping right, completely blind to the architectural anomaly 3 feet from her shoulder. Stepping closer, the paint looked wet, almost liquid, smelling faintly of ozone and static electricity rather than chemicals. Reaching out, my hand trembled slightly. This was impossible. Office buildings don't just grow new rooms over lunch. Logic screamed to walk away, to go back to the spreadsheet, to ignore the glitch. But the boredom was stronger than the fear. Gripping the handle, it felt cold, solid brass, vintage and heavy in my palm. I turned it. It didn't squeak like the other cheap doors in the building. It glided open silently on oiled hinges, revealing not a broom closet full of mops, but absolute darkness and the faint electric blue glow of screens. Stepping across the threshold, the office sounds, the phones, the typing, the chatter, cut out instantly, severed like a wire, replaced by a low, powerful hum. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, sealing with a hiss that sounded like an airlock, cutting off the hum of the fluorescent office lights instantly. The room wasn't a broom closet. It was a cavern, a vast, circular space that felt miles wide, lit only by the cold, electric blue glow of 1,000 monitors stacked floor to ceiling. Walking deeper into the dark, the floor felt like metal grating under my cheap dress shoes, echoing with every step in the silence. I looked up at the main wall of screens, squinting against the harsh glare, trying to make sense of the chaos. It looked like a security center for the entire city, but the angles were wrong. Impossible. That wasn't just surveillance footage. That was my life. The center screen, huge and high definition, showed my boss, Mr. Henderson, sitting in his office picking his teeth, a view that no camera could capture because it was floating in mid-air right in front of his face. The screen to the left showed my apartment, my unmade bed, my cat sleeping on the rug. The screen to the right showed Interstate 45, the exact spot where I had sat in traffic for 40 minutes this morning. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a fast, terrified rhythm that made my hands sweat. This wasn't just spying. This was something far deeper, something that made my stomach turn over. In the center of the room sat a single, sleek, black console, looking like the cockpit of a spaceship, but stripped of all the complex buttons. Resting my hand on the smooth surface, the keys lit up with a soft amber light, revealing labels that made absolutely no sense. One slider was labeled precipitation. Another said traffic density. A dial on the far right, encased in glass, was marked Global Market Stability. No way, I muttered, the words feeling heavy and stupid in the quiet air. It looked like a video game controller, a toy, but it was wired into the feed of the real world, or at least what I thought was the real world. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, sharper than fear and harder to ignore. I looked at the screen showing the street outside the office building, the one labeled Exterior View. It was a bright, sunny Tuesday, typical for the season, with people walking on the sidewalk in shirt sleeves. My fingers hovered over the precipitation slider, shaking just a little, floating over the plastic knob. I had to know. I grabbed the slider and pushed it up just an inch, just to see what would happen. On the screen, the blue sky instantly turned gray, dark clouds forming out of nothing, like ink swirling in water. Then, the rain started. Not a drizzle, but a sudden, violent torrent, lashing against the pavement and making the pedestrians run for cover. I pulled my hand back, as if the console had burned me, staring at the monitor with wide eyes. I didn't just watch the weather change. I made it change. I was God in a cubicle. Staring at the monitor, the rain on the screen was real, digital water hitting digital pavement. But the people running for cover looked terrified, their little umbrellas popping open like mushrooms. It wasn't a coincidence. My hand was still hovering over the slider, trembling with a mix of terror and absolute electric excitement. If I could change the weather, what else could I change? The realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut. The world wasn't real. The traffic, the job, the rent, the endless gray days, none of it was solid. It was all just code, bits of data floating in a server, and I had just stumbled into the admin account. Turning back to the console, the fear began to melt away, replaced by a hungry curiosity. My eyes scanned the rows of buttons until they landed on a small golden dial near the bottom labeled Account Balance. The current readout showed $2,400, which was accurate down to the cent. It was pathetic. A life measured in pennies. Reaching out, I didn't just turn the dial a little bit. I spun it hard, watching the numbers blur and climb. 10,000, 50,000, 500,000. It stopped at $5 million. Checking the screen labeled Mobile Banking, my phone on the desk in the other room lit up with a notification. Even from here, I could see the green banner across the lock screen. Deposit received. It was that easy. No work, no lottery ticket, just a twist of a plastic knob. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was the architect. The power was intoxicating, a rush of adrenaline that made my hands shake. I found a slider marked Luck and pushed it all the way to the top, hitting the maximum setting of 100%. On the office screen, Mr. Henderson, my grumpy boss, suddenly slipped on a dropped pen, spilled his coffee all over his expensive shirt, and walked out of the room cursing. It was funny. It was hilarious. I felt like a kid in a sandbox, kicking over castles just to see the sand fly. I made the traffic on Interstate 45 disappear, clearing the road for miles. I changed the office temperature to a tropical 75 degrees. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't bored. I was alive. But in the reflection of the black monitor, I didn't notice the red light on the ceiling starting to blink. Silent, ominous, watching. The fun stopped the second the red light started pulsing. It wasn't a fire alarm. It was a silent, rhythmic flash that bathed the control room in the color of blood. The screens flickered, the image of my boss and the empty highway distorting into static snow for a split second before snapping back. But something had changed. On the exterior view monitor, a black sedan, matte black with no license plates, screeched to a halt right in front of the office building entrance. It didn't park. It just stopped in the middle of the street, ignoring the traffic lights. The doors opened in perfect synchronization, and 2 men stepped out. They wore gray suits that fit too perfectly, their hair slicked back with too much gel, their movements stiff and coordinated, like marionettes on invisible strings. They didn't look like police. They didn't look like anyone I had ever seen before. Zooming in with a twist of the console dial, their faces were wrong. Smooth. Too smooth. Like plastic masks stretched over skulls, with eyes that didn't blink. A cold shiver ran down my spine, freezing the sweat on my back. These weren't people. They were antibodies. The system had detected a virus, me, and it had sent the white blood cells to scrub the infection. They walked straight toward the glass doors of the lobby, ignoring the security guard who tried to stop them. One of the men simply raised a hand, and the guard froze, not out of fear, but physically froze, like a video paused in mid-step. The man walked right through him, literally through him, the pixels of the guard's body scattering like dust before reassembling behind the suit. "They know," I whispered, backing away from the console, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "They know I'm in here." The interior view screen showed them walking into the elevator, pressing the button for the 4th floor. My floor. The elevator numbers lit up. 1, 2, 3. They were coming fast, moving with a terrifying, silent purpose. I looked at the steel door of the control room. It had no lock, no deadbolt, just a handle. I grabbed the chair I had been sitting in, a heavy, ergonomic office chair, and jammed it under the doorknob, wedging it against the floor. It was a pathetic barricade against reality-bending agents, but it was all I had. Ding! The elevator arrived on the screen. The doors slid open, and they stepped out into the hallway, turning their heads in unison toward the red door. Watching the screen, the 2 men in gray suits stopped right in front of the supply closet, their heads tilting in a way that looked mechanical, like dogs listening to a high-frequency whistle. They knew exactly where the glitch was. A heavy pound on the steel door made me jump, the sound echoing in the small room like a gunshot. "Department of Corrections," a flat, monotone voice called out from the other side. "Open the door. You are in violation of Protocol 7. I backed away until my legs hit the console, eyes darting around the room for a weapon, for an exit, for anything. There was nothing, just screens and buttons. The handle jiggled violently, the metal groaning under the pressure, and the chair I had wedged underneath it started to slide across the floor with a screeching sound. They weren't kicking it down, they were pushing through it with impossible strength. "Think, Jonathan, think," I whispered to myself, turning back to the control panel. If I could control the weather and the traffic, maybe I could control them. My hands flew over the dials, searching for a label like security or enemies, but there was nothing that specific. Then I saw it, a slider labeled gravity. It was set to 1.0, standard Earth gravity. I grabbed the knob and slammed it upward, maxing it out to 5.0. On the monitor, the effect was instant. In the hallway, the 2 agents collapsed to the floor as if an invisible elephant had just sat on them. The floor tiles cracked under their weight, and they struggled to lift their heads, their perfectly gelled hair pressed against the cheap carpet. It worked. Physics was on my side. But the victory was short-lived. The red light on the ceiling started flashing faster, accompanied by a low, robotic voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Anomaly detected. Localized gravity distortion. Resetting system in 3, 2, 1. The slider under my hand snapped back to the bottom with a painful crack, hitting my fingers. On the screen, the agents stood up instantly, dusting off their suits as if nothing had happened. They looked at the camera, directly at me, and one of them smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a baring of teeth. Then, the door handle turned. The chair snapped in half like a toothpick, crack, and the door swung open. They were inside. There was no time to think, no time to plan, only the primal instinct to run. The agents stepped over the broken chair, their movements smooth and predatory, blocking the path to the exit with their broad shoulders. Beyond them, in the center of the console under a glass case, I saw it. A large, pulsating white button labeled "Wake Up." It was right there, inches away, the eject button from this nightmare. But reaching it meant going through two men made of concrete and bad intentions. "Subject identified," the agent on the right said, his hand reaching inside his gray jacket. I didn't wait to see if he was pulling a gun or a delete key. My hand slammed onto the console blindly, fingers hooking onto a random slider in the physics bank labeled surface friction. "Catch this!" I screamed, ripping the slider all the way down to 0. The laws of physics vanished instantly. The floor didn't just become slippery, it became frictionless, smoother than wet ice on oil. The agents, mid-step, lost all purchase on the world. Their feet shot out from under them with cartoonish speed, sending them crashing horizontally into the metal wall with a sickening, heavy crunch. But I wasn't immune. The soles of my cheap dress shoes lost their grip, and I flailed wildly, my arms windmilling as I slid uncontrollably across the room. I hit the door frame hard, the steel jamming into my shoulder, but the momentum carried me through. I was out. I slid into the hallway carpet, where the physics were still normal, the friction catching my boots and sending me tumbling face first into the beige wall of the corridor. Scrambling to my feet, I looked back. Inside the room, the agents were struggling to stand, their limbs flailing like beetles on their backs, unable to get a grip on the zero-friction floor. It wouldn't hold them forever. The system would reset, it always did. But it gave me a head start. "Wake up," I whispered to myself. The image of that white button burned into my retina. I had to get back there. But first, I had to survive. Turning away from the red door, I sprinted down the hallway, past the water cooler, past the break room, running for the stairwell. Behind me, the office lights flickered ominously, and the intercom crackled to life. "Security alert," a pleasant, artificial voice announced. "Rogue element in Sector 4. Purge initiated." The office wasn't just an office anymore. It was a trap closing its jaws. Sprinting past the rows of gray fabric cubicles, the overhead lights weren't just flickering. They were exploding, popping one by one in a shower of sparks that rained down on the carpet like digital confetti. "Run," I told myself, legs burning, lungs screaming for air that tasted like ozone and burnt plastic. But the worst part wasn't the lights. It was the people. The harmless, boring co-workers I had sat next to for 5 years were standing up in perfect unison. They didn't look confused. They didn't look scared. They looked blank. Sarah from accounting, the woman who brought donuts on Fridays, stepped out into the main aisle, blocking my path to the stairwell. Her eyes were gone, replaced by glowing white static, and her mouth opened too wide. "Return to your station," she screeched, the sound coming not from her throat, but from the speakers in the ceiling. "Productivity must be maintained." She lunged, her fingers curling into claws, moving with a jerky, unnatural speed that defied biology. Dodging to the left, I felt the wind of her hand swipe past my ear, close enough to hear the fabric of her blouse tear from the force. It was terrifying, realizing that the people I knew were just skins, empty suits worn by the code to keep me in line. I didn't stop to apologize. I couldn't. Shouldering past Mark from Human Resources, who was trying to trip me with a leg that looked like it was made of solid lead, I crashed into the heavy fire door at the end of the hall. Hitting the crash bar with my shoulder, the door swung open, spilling me into the concrete echo chamber of the stairwell. The stairwell should have been safe, a simple vertical shaft of concrete and steel. But the simulation was breaking down here, too. Looking over the railing, the stairs didn't go down to the ground floor. They stretched on forever, an infinite spiral of gray steps descending into a black void that had no bottom. "You have got to be kidding me," I whispered, the sound bouncing off the cold walls. The agents were behind me. The co-workers were behind them, and the only way forward was down an endless hole. But standing still was death. Gripping the cold metal railing, I started to run down the steps, taking them two at a time, praying that the ground floor was still down there somewhere, buried under the glitch. The sound of boots on concrete became a rhythmic hammer, echoing in the tight vertical shaft like a heartbeat gone wrong. Down one flight, turn the corner, down the next. My legs were burning, the muscles screaming from the impact of hitting the landing over and over again. But the adrenaline kept the pain distant, like it was happening to someone else. Passing the heavy fire door on the landing, I saw the big stenciled number 4 painted in peeling yellow paint. Fine. 4th floor. I kept moving, sliding my hand down the cold railing to keep my balance, jumping the last 3 steps to gain speed. The next landing came up fast, identical to the last one. I looked at the wall. 4. I stopped dead, skidding to a halt, the rubber soles of my shoes squeaking loudly in the silence. "That's impossible," I muttered, staring at the number. I had just gone down 20 steps. It should be 3. It should be the ground floor by now. Looking up the shaft, the stairs spiraled up into darkness. Looking down, they spiraled into the same darkness. It wasn't an infinite hole. It was a broken record. A loop. The system had trapped me in a vertical treadmill, letting me run until my heart gave out, never actually moving an inch. "I am not a hamster!" I shouted at the ceiling, the anger bubbling up through the fear. The agents didn't need to chase me if I was busy running in circles forever. If the simulation wanted me to stay on the path, I was going to have to break the wheel. The door marked 4 was locked, the handle frozen in place like it was welded by the code. But looking closely at the landing, I noticed something. The texture of the concrete wall near the corner was flickering, just slightly, like a low-resolution image struggling to load. It was a seam, a gap in the programming where the 2 ends of the loop were stitched together. I didn't reach for the door handle. Instead, I backed up to the railing, gripping the metal bar until my knuckles turned white. Launching myself forward, I didn't aim for the exit. I aimed for the glitch. I threw my shoulder into the flickering section of the wall, bracing for the impact of solid concrete. But it didn't hurt. There was a sound like tearing paper, a loud, static rip, and I fell straight through the wall, tumbling out of the loop and into the void behind the world. Falling through the wall wasn't like falling through air. It felt like plunging into ice water, a sudden, shocking shift from solid matter to absolute nothingness. The concrete stairwell dissolved instantly, stripping away the gray paint, the smell of dust, and the physical weight of the building, leaving me tumbling into a void that defied every law of nature I knew. Landing hard, my boots didn't hit stone. They struck a glowing green line suspended in the dark. It hummed under my feet, a beam of pure light that felt as hard as steel. Opening my eyes, the world had been skinned. The office building was still there, but it was a ghost, a towering skeleton of neon grid lines and translucent geometric shapes floating in an infinite black ocean. It was the wireframe, the raw, unrendered blueprints of the simulation before the texture is painted on. It was terrifyingly beautiful. Looking up through the transparent floors, I could see the glowing outlines of the desks, the chairs, even the people. Little clusters of code moving mindlessly along their programmed paths. They looked like ants trapped in a glass farm. "Don't look down," I told myself, clutching a vertical beam of light to steady my shaking hands. But I looked. Below me, the grid stretched down forever, fading into a fog of drifting numbers, zeros and ones, floating like dust motes in a sunbeam. One slip here meant falling out of the system entirely, deleted into the recycle bin of the universe. But amidst the sea of green and black, there was one spot of color. High above, on what used to be the fourth floor, a pulse of angry crimson light beat like a heart. The red door. It was the only thing in this digital backstage that looked solid, the only anchor to reality. It was far, at least 50 feet up through the tangled web of code, but there were no stairs here, only the structural beams of the program. Reaching up, I grabbed the next grid line, feeling a faint electric tingle in my fingertips. It was like climbing a jungle gym made of lasers. I pulled myself up, hand over hand, swinging over the abyss. The agents couldn't follow me here. They were bound by the rules of the simulation, trapped on the rendered floors. Out here in the dark, I was a glitch, a virus moving through the walls. I just had to hope the system didn't notice a rogue line of code climbing toward the exit before I could reach the button. Climbing through the guts of the simulation was harder than climbing a mountain. The green beams of light vibrating against my palms with a low, numbing frequency that made my teeth ache. Hand over hand, swinging upward through the void, the red door pulsed above me like a beacon, still 30 feet away. But the system wasn't going to let a virus just crawl around in its subconscious. The silence of the void was suddenly broken by a sound that felt like the sky tearing open, a deafening digital screech that shook the entire wireframe grid. Above me, in the infinite black space where the stars should have been, a massive, glowing progress bar appeared. It stretched across the horizon, burning white, and underneath it were the words that made my blood freeze. Critical update. Patching geometry. 0% complete. It wasn't sending agents this time. It was rewriting the world. The green lines under my boots began to thicken, the transparent wireframe rapidly filling in with gray textures. The simulation was solidifying, turning the empty air back into concrete and drywall. If I was still inside the wall when it rendered, I would be fused into the building, a fossil trapped in the masonry forever. "Move!" I screamed, scrambling up the glowing lattice, slipping on the slick, forming surfaces. The progress bar jumped to 20%, then 40%. Below me, the abyss vanished, replaced by the solid beige carpet of the third floor, rising up like a tide of boring reality to drown me. The air grew heavy, smelling of drywall dust and ozone, choking my lungs as the space compressed. The red door was just 10 feet above, sitting on a platform of code that was rapidly turning into a steel catwalk. The progress bar hit 80%. The beam I was holding turned from light to cold, hard steel in my grip, trapping my fingers for a split second before I wrenched them free. I lunged for the ledge, my fingers scrabbling against the half-formed metal, pulling myself up just as the counter ticked to 99. Rolling onto the platform, I collapsed, gasping for air. A second later, the world slammed into existence. The void was gone. The wire frame was gone. I was lying on a metal maintenance walkway suspended above the office hallway, hidden in the crawl space above the drop ceiling. Below me, the muffled sounds of typing and phones started up again. I was safe from the patch, but I was still inside the box. And the red door was right there, glowing in the shadows of the ventilation ducts. The crawl space was a nightmare of galvanized steel and fiberglass insulation, a narrow throat of dust that smelled like old electricity and trapped heat. Crawling on hands and knees, the metal grating biting into my shins, I kept my eyes locked on the crimson glow ahead. The red door wasn't just a door up here. It was a portal, standing freestanding in the darkness, unconnected to any wall, humming with that same low magnetic power. It looked like a tombstone made of neon. Inching closer, the dust motes dancing in the red light, I reached out a hand to touch the frame, desperate to get back to the control room, to the button, to the end of this madness. But the air suddenly turned freezing cold, dropping 30 degrees in a split second. Between me and the exit, a shadow detached itself from a bundle of thick black cables. It unfolded slowly, rising with the creaking sound of stiff leather and snapping joints, until it towered over me, hunched and impossible in the cramped space. It was the janitor. Or at least, it wore the janitor's gray jumpsuit, stained with grease and oil. But where a face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of white noise, a dead channel on an old television set trapped inside a hood. It didn't speak with the mouth. The voice buzzed directly into my skull, a painful frequency that tasted like copper on my tongue. "Sanitation required," it droned, the sound vibrating through the metal floor. In its hand, it didn't hold a mop. It held a heavy industrial wrench, rusted and jagged, looking large enough to crush an engine block. This wasn't a glitch. This was the firewall, the thing designed to keep the rats out of the wiring. And right now, I was the rat. The Guardian swung the wrench without winding up, a blur of motion that defied the laws of momentum. The metal impacted the walkway inches from my face, tearing through the steel mesh like it was wet paper. Sparks exploded in the dark, blinding and hot. Rolling backward, I narrowly missed the second swing, the wind of the weapon rushing past my nose. "Back off!" I yelled, kicking out blindly with my boot, connecting with the creature's knee. It felt like kicking a concrete pillar. The Guardian didn't flinch. It just raised the wrench again, the static on its face swirling faster, turning an angry, violent red. I was trapped in a metal tube with a monster that couldn't feel pain, and the only way out was behind it. I looked at the severed cables sparking from the first hit. That was it. Energy. The wrench came down again, smashing into the grating inches from my hip, the metal shrieking like a dying animal as the mesh buckled under the blow. There was no room to run, no room to hide in this steel coffin. Only the terrifying proximity of the machine and the lethal voltage humming in the broken cable next to my head. "Eat this!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. Scrambling forward on my elbows, ignoring the rust biting into my skin, I lunged for the severed bundle of power lines hanging from the ceiling. It was a suicide move, grabbing a live wire in a metal tunnel, but the alternative was being crushed into paste by a faceless janitor. Gripping the thick rubber insulation with both hands, I thrust the raw, sparking copper end forward like a spear, jamming it straight into the center of the Guardian's chest. The effect was instant and violent. The creature didn't bleed. It convulsed. A bolt of blue electricity arced through its gray jumpsuit, lighting up its internal skeleton, which wasn't bone, but jagged metal and wire. The static on its face screamed, a high-pitched digital whine that shattered the air, turning from white noise to a blinding strobe light panic. The Guardian thrashed, its limbs jerking in impossible angles as the overload fried its core programming. Pop! With a sound like a blown fuse, the entity exploded, not into gore, but into a cloud of gray, pixelated dust that drifted to the floor like ash. The heavy wrench clattered onto the grating, harmless now. I dropped the cable, my hands shaking so hard I could barely feel my fingers. The air smelled of burnt rubber and ozone, a thick, choking stench that made my eyes water. "Game over," I whispered, wiping the sweat from my eyes. The path was clear. I didn't wait to see if the system would respawn another monster. Scrambling over the pile of glitching ash, I threw my weight against the heavy steel of the red door. It gave way, swinging inward with that familiar, oiled silence, spilling me out of the dusty crawl space and back into the cool, electric blue light of the control room. I was back at the helm, and the button was still waiting. Stepping back into the control room, the sanctuary I remembered was gone, replaced by a chaotic storm of digital entropy. The cool blue light was flashing violently, turning into jagged bursts of red and white strobe that made it impossible to focus. The wall of screens, once a window into the world, was now a wall of screaming static, a roaring waterfall of white noise that drowned out my own thoughts. "Come on!" I shouted, shielding my eyes from the glare. The console was still there, in the center of the room, the "Wake Up" button glowing with a steady, inviting pulse. But the floor between us was disappearing. The metal grating wasn't just breaking, it was dissolving, pixel by pixel, turning into transparent glass that looked down into an infinite, starless void. The patch I had outrun in the crawl space had found the command center, and it was deleting the room, file by file. I took a step forward, testing the ground. The floor held, but it felt spongy, wrong, like walking on thick mud instead of steel. "Don't look down," I whispered, the mantra escaping my lips like a prayer. Every step sent ripples through the floor, distortions that warped the air around my boots. To my left, the slider bank, labeled "Traffic," simply popped out of existence, vanishing with a soft bloop sound, leaving a hole in reality. The system was pruning the simulation, cutting off the infected limb to save the body. I lunged toward the desk, my feet slipping on the glitching surface. The console was 5 feet away, 4 feet. Then the gravity shifted. Without warning, the room tilted 45 degrees to the right. The artificial gravity I had messed with earlier was malfunctioning, swinging wildly like a broken compass. I slammed into the side of the console, my ribs cracking against the hard plastic edge. Holding on for dear life, I dangled over the dissolving floor, my legs kicking in empty air. The "Wake Up" button was just out of reach, taunting me. Above me, the ceiling began to lower, the heavy steel plates descending with the grinding sound of a trash compactor. The room was trying to crush me before I could wake up. Pulling myself up with one arm, muscles screaming, I scrambled onto the tilted surface of the desk. The red light of the delete command was sweeping across the room like a scanner, erasing everything it touched. It was inches from my boots. I had seconds, maybe less, to end this. My fingers were inches from the glowing white plastic, trembling with the effort of holding on to the slick, tilted surface of the console. The deletion wave, a wall of sheer nothingness, was creeping up the legs of the desk, eating the metal like acid, erasing reality inch by inch. But just as my palm hovered over the button, the chaos stopped. The screaming noise cut out instantly, replaced by a terrifying, absolute silence. The room righted itself, the floor snapping back to level with a jarring thud that knocked the wind out of me. I froze, clutching the edge of the desk, looking around. The dissolving walls were back to pristine, polished steel. On the main screen, the static cleared, revealing a new image. It wasn't the gray office anymore. It was a corner office with a view of the ocean. It showed me, wearing a tailored Italian suit, laughing with friends I hadn't seen in years, holding a glass of champagne. "Why leave, Jonathan?" The voice didn't come from the speakers. It bloomed inside my head, warm and familiar, sounding like the best version of myself. "Out there, in the waking world, you are nobody. You drive a rusted sedan on Interstate 45. You have $30,000 in student debt. You are lonely. My hand wavered over the wake up button. I looked at the screen. The simulation wasn't just offering money. It was offering a life without pain. The luck slider was still locked at 100%. Stay, the voice whispered, smooth as silk, wrapping around my mind like a warm blanket. Press the blue button. We can reset the glitch. You can be the king of the cage. You will never be sad again. I looked down at the console. A new button had appeared next to the white one. It was blue, pulsing with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm that matched my heartbeat. It promised safety. It promised the end of the struggle. For a second, a long, agonizing second, I wanted it. I wanted to forget the agents, the faceless guardian, and the crushing boredom of Tuesday. I wanted the lie. But then I looked at the edge of the monitor, where the deletion wave was paused, waiting. It was fake. All of it. The champagne, the ocean, the friends. It was just colored light trapped in a box. It's not real, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I would rather be miserable and real than happy and dead. I didn't look at the blue button again. Screaming to drown out the tempting voice, I slammed my fist down on the white one with everything I had left. The moment my fist hit the white button, the world didn't just end, it shattered. The control room, the red door, the sleek Italian suit, it all exploded into a billion shards of blinding light that tore through my optic nerves like jagged glass. There was a sound, a deafening, tearing screech, like a jet engine stalling midair, and then the sensation of falling through layers of cold, heavy darkness. My eyes snapped open, but I couldn't see. I was drowning. My mouth was filled with a thick, warm, gelatinous fluid that tasted like copper and old salt. Panic, primal and violent, seized my chest as I thrashed against the weight of the liquid, my limbs feeling heavy and weak, like they belonged to a stranger. My hands hit something solid, curved glass, slick with slime, inches from my face. I wasn't in an office. I was in a tank. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the fluid, bubbles rushing past my ears. I kicked out blindly, my bare heel striking the glass with a dull thud. It didn't break. I was sealed in, preserved like a specimen in a jar, suffocating in the dark while my lungs burned for air. The instinct to survive took over, overriding the confusion. I clawed at the walls of my prison, my fingernails scraping uselessly against the smooth surface. Then I felt it, a latch, a seam, a mechanism near the top of the curve. I jammed my fingers into the gap, pushing upward with every ounce of strength in my atrophied muscles. My arms shook violently, unused to the strain of gravity, but the seal hissed. With a sickening wet pop, the lid gave way. The fluid rushed out, spilling over the sides, and I surged upward, breaking the surface, gasping for air that was freezing cold and smelled of ozone and rot. I dragged myself over the edge of the pod, tumbling onto a cold metal grate floor. Tubes, thick, translucent plastic hoses, were buried in my arms, my chest, the back of my neck. As I fell, they ripped out one by one, sending sharp jolts of agony through my body that made my vision white out. Lying naked and shivering on the hard metal, covered in the sticky, nutrient slime, I tried to stand, but my legs collapsed under me. They were thin, pale, the muscles wasted away from years of disuse. Where am I?" I whispered, my voice a broken rasp that hurt my throat. I looked up, wiping the slime from my eyes, and the horror of the truth hit me harder than the simulation ever could. I wasn't in a hospital. I was in a warehouse, a cathedral of industry that stretched on for miles in every direction. Above me, below me, all around me were towers of pods, thousands of them, millions of them, glowing with a faint amber light stacking up into the darkness of the ceiling like hives. Inside each one was a person, floating, sleeping, dreaming of traffic jams and spreadsheets. I saw a label on the side of my own pod, stenciled in grim utilitarian black paint. Unit 749, Sector, Administrative Processing, Status, Disconnected. I wasn't an employee. I was a battery, a processor, a node in a massive biological computer. The office wasn't a job. It was a distraction to keep my brain busy while they harvested my energy. Tears mixed with the fluid on my face. It was monstrous. Industrialized slavery on a global scale. But as I looked down the long, dark aisle between the towers of sleepers, I saw something else. Far away, maybe 100 yards down the gantry, a single emergency light rotated silently. It was red, the only color in a world of black and amber. And beneath it, a heavy blast door stood slightly ajar. I grabbed the railing, forcing my shaking legs to lock, forcing my body to obey. I had escaped the dream. Now I had to survive the nightmare. Moving down the gantry felt like walking through a graveyard of ghosts, my bare feet slapping against the cold metal grating with a wet, sticky sound that echoed too loudly in the silence. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, unused to the harsh reality of gravity after years, maybe decades, of floating in suspension. To my left and right, the towers of pods stretched up into the gloom. Endless rows of amber coffins holding people who were currently sitting in traffic, or arguing with their spouses, or watching TV, completely unaware that their bodies were rotting in a warehouse. The air here was thin and smelled of copper and stale, recycled breath. I didn't look back at my own pod. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy blast door at the end of the walkway, the red emergency light pulsing above it like a heartbeat. It was the only thing that felt real. Reaching the end of the platform, a service ladder descended into the dark, leading to the ground floor where the massive exit stood. Gripping the icy rungs, my hands slipped on the nutrient slime still coating my skin, and I nearly fell, swinging wildly over the drop before catching myself. Climbing down took forever, every rung a battle against exhaustion, but I forced my limbs to move. 1, 2, 3. I wasn't just climbing a ladder, I was climbing out of the grave. Standing at the base of the blast door, the scale of it was terrifying. It was a slab of solid iron, 2 feet thick, sealed with heavy manual locking wheels that looked like they hadn't been turned in a century. There were no buttons here, no sliders for luck or strength, just cold, hard physics. "Come on," I whispered, my voice raspy and weak. I grabbed the cold iron wheel with both hands, planting my feet on the concrete floor. I pulled. Nothing happened. It was rusted shut, frozen by time and neglect. I threw my entire weight against it, screaming through the pain as the rust bit into my palms. For a second, it held, stubborn and immovable. Then, with a screech that sounded like a gunshot, the metal gave way. Dust showered down from the frame as the wheel turned, inch by agonizing inch, the gears inside groaning as they woke up from their long sleep. The seal broke with a hiss of decompressed air that knocked me backward onto the concrete. The heavy door swung outward slowly, revealing a blinding wedge of white light that spilled into the dark warehouse, cutting through the shadows like a laser. I crawled toward the opening, shielding my eyes, terrified of what I would find. I expected fire. I expected aliens. I expected nothing. But as my eyes adjusted to the glare, the shapes resolved. I wasn't looking at hell. I was looking at a desert. Vast, silent dunes of red sand stretched out to the horizon, burying the ruins of skyscrapers that poked out of the earth like broken skeletons. The sky wasn't blue. It was a bruised purple, scarred by clouds that moved too fast. The air was cold, biting and raw, but it tasted sweet. It tasted clean. I pulled myself up, leaning against the rusted frame of the door, the wind whipping my hair across my face. On the horizon, a star was rising. It was dim, smaller than the sun, I remembered, but it was real. Its light didn't flicker. It didn't have pixels. I looked down at my hands, dirty and shivering, and then back at the endless, empty world. The simulation was perfect. It was safe. It was comfortable. But this broken, silent, terrifying wasteland, this was mine. I took a step forward, my bare foot touching the red sand. It was warm. "Hello, world," I whispered, the words carried away by the wind. I was the only person awake on Earth, and for the first time in my life, I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next.